Well, growing up, I am sure most of you learned in school, like I did, the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. It's probably the most famous story about the life of George Washington. And if you remember, George Washington was 6 years old, and he took a hatchet and he chopped his father's prized cherry tree. And when his father discovers the tree, he's so angry and he confronts young George, and young George says, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. It was I who chopped the tree." And do you remember what the father does? The father reaches down and embraces young George. And it says he rejoices because his son's honesty was worth more than 1,000 cherry trees. It's a wonderful story. What's really ironic about this story is that this is a story that teaches us the importance of honesty, and yet this story is a lie. It never actually happened. It was a story that was made up by one of George Washington's first biographers, who happened to also be a minister. And he wanted to establish to this young nation that the first president was someone to emulate. And so he invented this story, the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. Now, many of the stories that we learned as kids in our history books about the founding of our country were stories that were written to inspire our patriotism and our love for country. So we all learned the beautiful story about Thanksgiving, how the Pilgrims and Indians, it was a love fest. They all sat down and shared a meal. And in reality, we know that the treatment of the Native Americans was disgraceful. And we learned as little kids about the land of the free. But we know that the founding fathers owned slaves, and that the founding fathers' own wives did not have freedom like the freedom to vote. We didn't hear those stories as kids because the writers of the early history wanted to establish in us a love and a pride for country. The writers who wrote the early stories of Christianity did the same exact thing. Those writers were writing stories to inspire people and instill in them a love for Christ. But many of those stories didn't actually happen. They are not historical accounts. And this is surprising for many Christians to discover, who said, these stories in the Bible, I thought they were all true. I thought they really happened. Well, the writers of these stories, Jesus' first biographers, if you will, they were mostly Jewish, and they were sharing these stories with the Jewish people. And what they were trying to establish to the Jewish people was, you know those stories you've heard for 1,000 years about your Jewish ancestors and how they were awaiting the Messiah? Well, the Messiah already came, and it was Jesus of Nazareth. And so what these early Christian writers did was, they took the old stories that the Jewish people were familiar with, and they wrote stories about Jesus that paralleled those. So our readings from the lectionary this morning are a perfect example of that. They're the exact same story, the one from the Old Testament and the one from the New Testament. Here we see a young man, the only son of a widow, lying on a funeral bed, and he rises from the dead. And again, we see that Luke in the New Testament is trying to establish to the Jewish people that Jesus is the new Elijah, the Messiah that was promised. The Jewish people were very familiar with Elijah's story. They knew that Elijah ascended into heaven on a golden chariot. So the New Testament writers also had Jesus ascend into heaven. But Jesus was better than Elijah. He didn't need a golden chariot. He didn't need a mode of transportation. Now, you know that there are many gospel writers. There are only 4 gospels that were included in the Bible, but many people wrote stories about Jesus that weren't included. Of all of those writers, only one person, Luke, writes this story about a young man rising from the dead. You would think that if Jesus actually did something like that, and how many times in the gospel did it say a large crowd? There was a large crowd. There would be so many witnesses who saw this incredible thing. Don't you think someone other than Luke would have written it down? So what's going on here? What actually is happening? Did Jesus actually do this? Or maybe not? And that's what I want to explore today. Now, we heard in our words of integration this morning that the ancient people expected miracles. They wanted to hear stories of the supernatural and miraculous things, because to them that was proof that this person really had the divine power. They expected miracles. Now, I grew up Catholic, and you know, in the Catholic Church, someone cannot be named a saint unless it is proven that they were responsible for 3 miracles. So take, for example, someone recent like Mother Teresa. I think we can all agree she was a very saintly woman. She was someone who dedicated her life to helping the poor and the dying. But Mother Teresa cannot be canonized a saint unless it is proven that she was responsible for 3 miracles. So her saintly life isn't enough. We want miracles. And the people in the ancient world wanted miracles. And there are stories about miraculous things. People who were born of virgins in all faith traditions, not just in Christianity. People who were born of virgins, people who could levitate, people who could make the blind see and who could raise the dead. All of these stories from all of these traditions. So my question for you is, if the ancient world had so many miracles, why did they stop? I mean, why today aren't people raising people from the dead like Jesus and Elijah did? Like Peter and Paul did? Did you know that? There are stories of them raising the dead. Like Buddha did. These are stories that were written before the time of Jesus. So if people were raising people from the dead then, why aren't we seeing that now? Could it be that those ancient stories are myths, and that the people of that time understood them as myths? Now, I've shared to you before this quote by John Dominic Crossan. John Dominic Crossan is one of the most scholarly biblical authorities in the world today. He knows more about the Bible than all of us in this room combined. John Dominic Crossan said this: "My point isn't that the ancient people told literal stories and now we're smart enough to understand them symbolically. My point is that the ancient people told stories symbolically and now we're just dumb enough to take them literally." The ancient people told stories in myths. I've told you before, a myth is not that something isn't true. A myth is a story that points to the truth. And the truth of this gospel, the truth that the gospel writer Luke is trying to get across is the people who experienced Jesus in person, the people who walked alongside of him, who were in his presence, those people experienced miracles. And so this story demonstrates for us that in the presence of the Christ, darkness became light. Death became new life. In the presence of Jesus, the blind, those of us walking in darkness, those of us who can't see, in the light of the Christ's presence, we see things in a new light. And those of us who are walking around asleep, who are spiritually dead, in the presence of the Christ, we experience new life. In his letter to the Ephesians, Paul says, "Awake, sleepers, rise from the dead, and Jesus will bring you light." Now think about it. The people to whom he was speaking, the people who he was writing to, when he said, "Rise from the dead," do you really think he was writing to a group of people who were physically dead? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, imagine people hearing the letter and going, "He thinks we're dead?" No, people said, "Rise from the dead." That's what it meant. It meant you are spiritually dead. You're not alive. You're just going through the motions of life. That's what he meant by rise from the dead. And so we hear these stories about people rising from the dead in the presence of these divine people. That's what this gospel story is trying to get us to see. The widow in this story, obviously this was a patriarchal society. So a woman didn't have any security if there was not a man to take care of her. So this woman has lost her husband, she's a widow, and now she's lost her only son. So she is really in darkness. And Jesus says to her, "Do not weep." You might think that's really insensitive. Imagine if we were having a funeral for someone and I said to their loved one who was crying, "Don't weep." And that sounds so cold. But Jesus is really trying to establish here is that this death and darkness is an illusion. That life is eternal. And that no matter what circumstance we're in, we can spiritually awaken. Now, what does it mean to be spiritually alive? Well, when I was preparing the talk for this week, I happened to read in one of my magazines, it said, these are the 12 symptoms of what it looks like if you are spiritually alive or spiritually awake. And you know, I love the number 12, because 12, I told you, was a number of spiritual completion. So let's see if any of these 12 symptoms relate to you. It says, if you are spiritually awake, you have an increased tendency to let things happen rather than make things happen. You have frequent attacks of smiling. You have feelings of being connected with others and with nature. You have frequent, overwhelming episodes of appreciation. You have a tendency to think and act spontaneously rather than from fears based on past experience. You have an unmistakable ability to enjoy each moment. You experience a loss of the ability to worry. You experience a loss of interest in conflict. You experience a loss of interest in interpreting the actions of others. You experience a loss of interest in judging others. And you experience a loss of interest in judging self. And finally, you gain the ability to love without expecting anything in return. That, to me, sounds a lot like the way of Jesus. When Jesus said, "Follow me, follow the way was, be grateful, love one another, don't worry, do not be afraid, live life to the full." That's what he said. And he was saying, if you follow this way, you won't be in darkness, you won't be asleep, you'll be awake, you'll be alive, you'll rise from the dead by following my way, this way of life that I'm showing you. Now, you know that I was a high school English teacher for many years. And one of the favorite things that I taught was a play called The Miracle Worker. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. It's about the story of Helen Keller. But Helen Keller is not the title character. She isn't the miracle worker. The miracle worker was her teacher, Annie Sullivan. Helen Keller's parents, they thought their daughter was just going to forever live in darkness, as did Helen Keller's doctors. Annie Sullivan thought differently. She believed differently. Now, did she cure Helen Keller's blindness or deafness? Not in the physical sense, but she got Helen Keller to see. She got Helen Keller to hear. And she gave Helen Keller a voice. That was miraculous. I know you want to expect a physical miracle. That, wow, she can now physically see. But to me, that play demonstrates what the gospel writers were trying to get across, that in the presence of Jesus, people experienced miracles. Their lives were transformed. Jesus said, all of the things that I have done, you can do. These things and greater. So he's saying, if I made miracles happen, so can you. But most people don't really believe that. And belief is what triggers miracles. So let us go forth in this Pentecost season. If we call ourselves believers, let us believe those words of Jesus, that we too are here to be miracle workers, that we are here to rise up, to awaken to new life, and then go forth into the world and help other people to rise up and be all that they were created to be. Namaste.